Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait a couple of minutes to let people join before we officially begin our session this afternoon. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for spending your lunch hour with us today, and welcome to today's virtual Lunch and Learn event brought to you by the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, Toronto Region. My name is Janelle Smith, and I'm a board member with IPAC Toronto and co-chair of the events committee alongside my colleague Khadija Elsabay, who will be moderating today's session. Before we dive into today's event, it's my pleasure to open the session with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that IPAC Toronto's headquarters is on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit Union. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. I'd now like to share a couple of words about IPAC for those who may not be familiar with us. So for over 70 years, the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, or IPAC, has been recognized as Canada's leading professional organization supporting excellence in the public sector and public administration. The Toronto chapter of IPAC supports our members across the Greater Toronto and Hamilton region. We organize and partner on events like this one that address important and emerging issues facing the public service of today. We provide a forum for learning, exchanging ideas, and networking. For those of you who like what you hear today and are interested in learning more about IPAC and potentially becoming a member, we'll include information and a link in the chat below, so please do check it out. And we would love to hear more from you after the session today. So today's session promises to deliver on our goal to explore highly topical and transformative topics through a focus on AI solutions for public services. We'll delve into questions such as how the public sector can continue to innovate with technologies like those offered through AI to improve service delivery while ensuring that AI is used ethically in ways that benefit the populations we serve. It's my pleasure to introduce today's panel members, starting with Katrina Ingram. Katrina is founder and CEO of Ethically Aligned AI, a company focused on helping organizations drive better outcomes through the design, development, and deployment of AI systems. Katrina is a seasoned executive with over 2 decades of experience running not-for-profit and corporate organizations in the technology and media sectors, as well as has experience in the public sector. Katrina is a member of Calgary Police Services Technology Ethics Committee and recently developed Canada's first micro-credential in AI ethics in partnership with Athabasca University. Our second panelist for today is Adam Morrison. Adam is president and CEO of the Ontario Tourism Education Corporation, a workforce development organization that offers evidence-based consulting, data solutions, training, and insightful research. In 2018, Adam led OTEC to establish Tourism SkillsNet Ontario, an award-winning network of destination-based consortiums that link employers, community employment and education, and municipal stakeholders and workforce plans. Most recently, Adam has been working with Canada's Future Skills Centre and a coalition of industry partners on a tourism and hospitality emergency response project. And our moderator for today's session is IPAC Toronto Region's own Khadija Elsabay. Khadija is an analyst in the Business Data and Analytics team at the Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy, a regulator in the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development in the Government of Canada. Khadija uses big data to report stats and information to external and external stakeholders and develop business intelligence tools that support the modernization of OSB's regulatory compliance programs. So very warm welcome to all of our panelists. Many thanks to you and Khadija for leading us in this conversation today on this important topic. There will be time for Q&As this afternoon, so please feel free to include questions for the panelists in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen as we go along, and we will get to them after our panelists have a chance to speak. It's now my pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to Khadija.
Thank you, Janelle. Welcome everyone to our discussion today on AI, how to use AI, how it can solve some of our problems, what are these challenges, what are the opportunities, what are the motivators, the barriers. We'll hope to cover it all and especially focus on ethics with the use of AI. So to start off the discussion, let's start off with the basics. What is AI and what is machine learning?
Well, I'll jump in on that one. And I just want to say, first off, thank you so much, Janelle, Khadija, and IPAC for inviting me to take part in this panel today and hosting a discussion on this really important topic. Now, we think this might be a very basic question, but it's actually quite a tricky question. What is AI? And I like to think about definitions on two different levels. There's denotative things, the definitions we find in a dictionary, and then there is what we think about things, connotative definitions. I'm going to give you a little bit of both. So let me share a dictionary-based definition. This is from OECD. So it says, an AI system is a machine-based system that is capable of influencing the environment by producing an output. Those could be predictions, recommendations, or decisions for a given set of objectives. So that's one definition, but I will share what's happening in this landscape is that people don't always agree with these definitions. And so there's a lot of discussion about what exactly is the definition that we're going to enshrine in law. Different groups are coming up with their own. And so when I think about AI, it's really become a bit of a marketing term. And that's why I like to meet people where they're at with the connotative definition. What do you think AI is all about? And those stories are informed by culture. They're informed by things like movies that we've seen. We all come to the table with some belief systems about these entities. And a lot of that has to do with this idea of some kind of super intelligence, something that's smarter than us. And so AI is this very, very broad term. The other term that I'll introduce now, just to help us in this discussion, is a little bit more specific, and that's machine learning. And machine learning is a very particular technique. If you can think of AI as the field of sports, you might think of machine learning as sports we can play with a ball. And it becomes a dominant way of enacting or enabling AI systems in the world right now. And so machine learning essentially is about finding patterns in data. So we take a bunch of data and we apply a whole bunch of statistics and different methods to it, and we find patterns in data, and then we use those to drive some of those predictions and recommendations. So those are a few terms that I think will come up again in the course of the discussion, and hopefully that helps give a bit of a framing for what is AI and how we're thinking about it today.
Thank you, Katrina. So Adam, you lead OTEC, which has had quite an interesting journey with adopting AI and using it in newcomer settlement, employment services, in many public services. How did that journey start off, and how did you start using AI?
Well, thanks, Khadija and IPAC for the invitation to join you today. It's a pleasure to kind of share our journey, because I think it's evolved rather practically in dealing with some of the challenges that our industry faces. There's a major theme of disruption, automation. It's been a threat to many industries, and we've arrived where we are today, and gradually trying to navigate that through kind of real world economic change. We started our forays into tech development really in the interest of providing scalability and consistency across all the different regions that we operate in through our sector-based alliance that you referenced, Tourism Skills Net Ontario. We work with small business and large businesses. We work with large employment service providers at the regional level, as well as very small and rural and remote operators. And the capacity, especially in terms of delivery capacity to job seekers, to mid-career workers, is very different across that network. One of the first tools that we developed was in the psychometric assessment space, leveraging algorithms to identify, fit for various high demand occupations in the absence of any transferable skills or experience. We partnered with Magnet and a psychometrics partner out of the UK, Lumina Learning, and developed a platform-based tool. One of the more interesting applications was during the Syrian refugee crisis and the refugee roundtable. We worked with Starbucks to help try and identify individuals, often the youth and family members of incoming refugees, to help identify those who might be interested in a job that offered benefits and some stability when they arrived in Canada. Out of the gates, we identified some of the challenges with psychometrics and potential biases in the algorithms, and it forced us to start reevaluating how the tool was deployed, the program design, in order to meet the needs of the population we're trying to serve. In general, it gave us experience working through the user journey, the lack of transparency that we did see in some of the tools out there. So it's more than the technology, it's how we implement them. And how we manage program design to maximize the benefits. In the end, we changed the program model several times as we were adjusting to different labor markets, when employers said, don't just send us those who might enjoy it, please send us people who need a job, and let's coach them through the various elements that they might find enjoyable or challenging, and we'll help mentor them and help them to be successful. But if they need stability, please let us engage them. So even then, but way before the pandemic, it was clear that this wasn't going to change. We were facing many upcoming disruptions. We were always tagged as an industry that faced a risk of automation, and we were interested in exploring more fluid and responsive models. In 2019, shortly after Canada's Future Skills Centre was launched, we started a project with Mars Data Catalyst Centre and FirstWork to start exploring how we could leverage a more seamless job seeker controlled career pathway. Because up until then, what we had seen is a kind of a fragmented network and an ecosystem where people were bouncing around a lot, being referred to different services, and even owning our own role in that environment, kind of an extractive relationship with the job seeker. And that's somewhat controlled by that intervention, us asking them to complete assessments, give them to us. We will share what results we deem necessary. And really not a lot of cumulative or retained value for that job seeker or worker or learner to protect them from the next crisis that they would be facing. So as part of that project, we entered into cross-Canada consultations and field testing with job seekers and employment service providers. And there were a few kind of fundamental characteristics that emerged. One was we need to consider an ecosystem approach. So there were enablers and constraints to adoption of new enhancements to the employment pathway at the systemic level, so government policy, at the organizational level, and at the user level. Also, again, considering that the marketplace for some of these tools, there is no one size fits all solution. The use case or the stage of the individual in their own pathway was critical. And so, again, the program wraparound to any one intervention and how we were supporting the clients in a kind of human-centric design was critical. We needed to consider convergence. There were many tools in an ecosystem, but we needed to bring them together to remove the barriers of using multiple tools. And again, that was previously sending people to many different service providers and resources, and then asking them to come back. And then finally, and where AI comes in, we needed to consider adaptive architecture. So really plugging systems into an online environment, leveraging real-time labor market data, and leveraging AI to be able to start translating the characteristics of the job seeker, of the worker, against that data, so that every time they interacted with this system, there was net new findings, net new opportunities revealed for them. So when the pandemic hit, we started building it. We saw hundreds of thousands of people laid off overnight in our sector in particular, but many others. And we had calls from corporate partners across Canada to help with outplacement, but we couldn't even, having a fairly strong model and networks of service providers across our province, we couldn't meet those demands. We began building it, again, in partnership with the Future Skills Centre. We weren't able to get it live in time to address the first round of layoffs, but by 2022, we were leveraging that new platform, Career Atlas, across our Tourism Skills Net network. And we knew that next time we would have the ability to support disruption at scale. So use case was always the key in our learnings from this deployment. And we've now begun adapting this platform to the newcomer settlement space. And we're working with IRCC on a 3-year research and development project with World Education Services, Access Employment, and Société d'économie d'Ontario to adapt the system to pre-arrival and settlement services. The technology in general is still emerging, but as we've been doing our work, so have others. And we now see it reflected in the academic sector, in employment services, and in many different spaces. And so it's going to keep changing the way we do things.
Wow. There's certainly a lot that was considered all throughout that. I mean, I was taking down some of what you said, looking at improving the user experience, looking at a human-centric design, the convergence of tools, having an adaptive architecture, an ecosystem approach, responding to disruption. There's a lot there that was considered, a lot that was going on. I think we can now move the discussion to talking about how can we ensure that this AI is being deployed in a way that is ethical, unbiased, it's equitable, it's responsible, so that the public communities are benefiting from it.
Well, I'm happy to jump in and share a few thoughts on that. And I think very much about my work on 2 different levels. One is harms mitigation. I'm in the harms mitigation business as an ethicist. And the second is pushing for greater systemic changes. And so when I think about how do we move forward, I think a lot about the values that underpin the way AI is built today and the way AI tends to be used today. And Adam's exactly right. Use case is super important. So when we think about how AI is built, it's built primarily by a very small group of players, largely coming out of big tech. They have, for the most part, a bit of a Wild West or move fast and break things ethic. They're the kind of firms that might drop a chatbot out of nowhere onto the world, for example, and then everybody has to deal with it. So I think we need to change that. I think we need to instill a lot more responsibility into the development cycle and do things a lot more thoughtfully. And then secondarily, with the use case, we need to really understand where it's appropriate to use these technologies, who is being impacted by these technologies, and really ensuring that we are not disproportionately impacting certain groups of people. So that really speaks to this idea of being equitable and being inclusive. I have to admit, I'm not 100% sure that we can ever be completely unbiased. And I think part of that for me stems from the use of data in these systems. And even if we try and adjust our data, make it more fair, make it less biased, I don't know if we can be completely unbiased in our approach. So that might be a failing of current machine learning methods. Maybe there's some other things out there in the future that will address that particular situation. But I have to admit, I'm a little skeptical about getting to this unbiased state. I think education is incredibly important. So talks like this one, having time to engage with people and talk about what's going on, ask questions, all of that I think is super important. And then the last thing I'll say on this is this idea of the greater the social complexity of a problem, the less capable machine learning systems are of accurately or reliably classifying or predicting. And this is from some research that was done by Abiba Burhain, who is a machine learning researcher. So if you think about this, there's this inverse relationship between social complexity of a problem and the ability for these machine learning systems to really address it well. So if you take that as a bit of a rule of thumb, you can see where machine learning might be more appropriate and where it might be less appropriate.
Adam, do you have any thoughts on, or any experiences with, figuring out the ethics, figuring out how to remove some of the bias?
I'm kind of torn because I agree with Katrina. Like, the horse is out of the barn. It's already in the market and impacting the economy. I did a little bit of polling even around our office and found that people were leveraging, ChatGPT to, try and improve written pieces and just testing it and working with it. It's out there. I mean, what kind of AI is this? Because we don't have control over it. And we as a network and we in our programming streams, we don't have control over it, and it's changing things, and it's going to start affecting the labor market. Is it this consumer AI, retail AI? Does it even have a label yet? It is definitely disruptive. When I think about ethical AI, it's a different, seems like a different environment or process or set of steps that we all need to take collectively. In doing a little bit of searching out a few resources this morning, I found a useful quote from Virginia Dignam in a report on responsible artificial intelligence, suggesting that it's not about the systems and their design, it's about the way we design them, why we design them, and who is involved in designing them. And so when we built our platform, we were very fortunate. It's a rare opportunity to be able to have the time and expertise among our partners and a community practice of technology partners and researchers to be able to explore the potential risks to our users, our vulnerable users who've lost their jobs and maybe from equity deserving labor pools, while also working to maximize the benefits, the SDGs of quality education, decent work, reduced inequality, poverty reduction. And those were inherent to our purpose in building it. We also had the time to work with users, on data governance, and legal expertise to confine it within a walled environment so that we could protect the data and security. So we worked with these populations, but that's so rare. When I look at the networks we work with, much of the adoption is ad hoc, it's reactive, it's responsive. And so I'm trying to consider how we can build that into the innovation cycle more regularly so that we can ensure that those principles are met, especially when they are being deployed in the publicly funded public service space.
So Adam, you mentioned that you had at one point in time for one of the projects the expertise. What was that expertise exactly?
So as I mentioned, working on Project Integrate, the initial exploratory study phase, we were working with Mars Data Catalyst Center. We were working with experts from Toronto Metropolitan University, the Future Skills Center. We had Blueprint, a public policy research partner attached to the project, providing guidance. And we had user validation and testing partners to help us along the way. We also did work with legal and guidance and data and security consultants. And again, this was before we dropped something on the market. So it's I think it's a different approach in our space, working with our client groups that we strive towards. But we have to acknowledge that that's not necessarily the norm. While we're doing this technology is in market and influencing, the system in ways that we can't necessarily predict or control.
Yeah. So AI, as you had said, as we have been saying, it's been used in so many ways. It's being, for instance, used to predict bus arrival times, to predict the impact of extreme weather events, to help with analyzing self-reported health data. An organization focusing on AI, Mila Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute, published a report which we can drop the link to. The report is titled AI in Cities, Risks, Applications, and Governance, which features many more examples of how, specifically in the public sector and really in the broader public sector, AI can be used and is being used. So I want to ask the two of you, what is, the most exciting, to you?
I can jump in, or sorry, go ahead, Adam.
Go ahead.
Looks like you're gonna let me go ahead. Okay, so before we get to that question, I just want to pick up on one thing. I think this is a very important point. We're in a bit of a paradigm shift. So what we've seen in the past, a year ago, when I started out doing talks about AI, I would talk about narrow AI, I would talk about model A doing use case A and model B doing use case B, et cetera, et cetera. What we're seeing now, and I think we're maybe talking about it in the language of consumer AI, but I think it's the paradigm shift in how we're thinking about building models. And so what's happening now is we're building what has become known as a foundation model. So these GPT technologies are that. And this idea is we'll put everything in the kitchen sink in terms of data into that model, and then we'll fine tune it for all these other use cases, and then we'll go from there. And this is really important because it's no more about use case A and model A working together. And that's really important. We'll get into data governance. That's really important from a governing the data standpoint. But it also starts to set up this dynamic that maybe we're going to have a number of very large foundation models that drive everything else. And we're not fully in control of that. How do we deal with that? And I think that's part of what cities are going to, and public service is going to have to grapple with, along with every other organization. So I'm going to connect that back to your original question. What do I think are interesting use cases and maybe safe use cases or ethical use cases? And I think about starting small with a particular problem that you want to solve and using the minimum amount of technology that you need to solve it. And that's where I like to start when I have conversations about how to do things in a more ethical manner, how to put a few more guardrails onto a project and control it a bit more. And so if there are projects, for example, that don't directly involve people, maybe that's a good use case. Maybe it's about optimizing some machines in a back-end process. Maybe that's a good use case to start with. So those are the kinds of things that I tend to think about when I think about getting started in ways for safe and responsible.
Adam, your thoughts?
I've been excited for a while about how AI and some of the applications that we've been working on can lead to better translation between all of the different segments of our, our shared, community service space. So we work with different levels of government, federal, provincial, newcomer services, essential skills. We work with industry, and we all use different language to describe skills and labor market needs. And we're often within our echo chambers within that broader ecosystem talking about, we need to market this new taxonomy or this new way of defining our work. But it's been decades, and it seems that we haven't moved that far ahead, and the world is internationalized. We have people coming in with their own terminology for the skills that they have, and their own conceptions of what the qualifications framework should be for different industries. So very excited about what these new technologies can do to help almost as a universal translator for the skills, the experience, the qualifications that people have. We're working on an advisory group with ESDC's Office for Skills for Success on the rollout. And again, we're talking about starting to promote the new framework, which is a brilliant framework that includes social and emotional skills and highly transferable skills. But really interested, and we've been raising it. What if we didn't necessarily focus entirely on marketing, but we focused on translating for the business community who uses different ways of defining what creativity and adaptability are? What if we focused on packaging for the different markets and then recording the program outcomes and sharing them in the terminology that our funding partners can leverage? Like that's really cool to me, to start, again, that term convergence, to start being able to pull together the different communities of practice that are advancing and preparing for the future of disruption in the economy, and bring us into the kind of same space. Ironically, applying that principle to protecting people, humans, against disruption is the ultimate goal. So we knew that there were, disruptions were going to be more and more frequent. We were anticipating that AI and automation was going to be the disruption that hit our industry. Ironically, it was a human, health issue that led to rapid R&D and brought some of these tools to market. But, I think it is ironic and exciting that AI itself could help protect our systems if they're properly deployed, and start to mitigate some of that and help people manage more fluid careers in a more rapidly changing environment.
I like that. So Katrina, as you said, start small with the least amount of technology, look at bringing together partners, the convergence of tools. I really like these ideas, and we've been mentioning, we mentioned machine learning, we mentioned a couple of times data governance, using data in these technologies that we build. What is the role of data governance, or what role can data governance have in these initiatives that involve, AI?
Adam, do you want to kick that one off?
On data governance, I mentioned fragmentation. I mentioned that kind of transactional relationship with the employment, training, and career system. I was in doing the project Integrate Research and Consultations. We came across two perspectives on data governance, and one was data sovereignty. The data needs to be portable. It should be owned by the individual. That is their profile, and every time we put them through an assessment, they should gain that self-awareness and that knowledge. They should be able to track their progress, and this is a pathway as opposed to an intervention at the point of crisis. And that appealed to me after years in the sector and watching what people take away post-program. And then there was the other perspective, and that was the public good of all of the data that can be gathered. And, think about, capturing and aggregating all of this individual learner and system user data at large, and what could be contributed towards policy outcomes. So I think I don't think we answered those questions or those debates during our project. Data trusts show promise. But I am, there are concerns. We experience them with users of some of the tools. Assessment technology in particular is getting powerful. You can tell a lot about a person through some of the latest assessments, and even, according to OECD research, predict some of their likelihood of long-term career success. We've got to protect that data and be very careful of how we manage it and store it and who it's released to.
I'm happy to jump in and react to some of that. And there's so much to say about data, and I've done like hour-long talks just on data itself. When I think about data governance, when I think about the people who are using the data and what they know about the data that they are using, I have a lot of concerns around that. So many organizations have poor data governance practices. They don't know where the data came from. They have no metadata about the data. There's no lineage. There's no sense of what this data is. And yet they're just plowing ahead to use it in some fashion. And I think that's a real risk. Data governance is not a sexy topic. It's certainly not as sexy as AI, but it's foundational, in my opinion, to getting things right in terms of building these products in responsible ways. And so time, effort, and care needs to be put into curating the data in an appropriate way, understanding whether you have the lawful basis for even having that data and for what use cases you have it for. And there's a particular set of responsibilities and legal obligations that the public sector has around the data. So those are enshrined in the Privacy Act and also in various regulations at a provincial level. So what you can actually do with data, especially when it contains PI in it or personal information, you have legal obligations around that. So that's kind of the usage of the data piece. When it comes to maybe thinking a bit more philosophically, as Adam's suggesting around, is data an asset that we own and get to control, this idea of data sovereignty? And a lot of that has been advanced by various Indigenous governments. They have a whole framework called OCAP, which speaks to that. Or is it just a public good, and whoever gathers that data and puts it in a database, they get to own it and control it in some way, and hopefully they'll do good things with it. And that's kind of the model that we have right now. So we have a model whereby the person who actually owns, or the entity that owns the data, is the one that gathers it. And I think that this is the public debate or discussion that we need to have, because there's validity to both sides of this argument, especially when we're thinking about aggregating data for use in the public good, to help address, social ills, or to advance research and science and those kinds of things. But there's also discussion, I think, to be had when this is done in the name of a private entity, when they are the ones who've gathered up all the data and have decided they're going to commercialize it. So there's a lot of nuance here in that discussion, and I certainly don't think we're going to solve it on the panel today, but hopefully we're giving you a few things to think about and to have further discussion about as you think about how you want to approach artificial intelligence and knowing the role of data in that process.
Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Adam. So I think we can now move from talking about data governance and, seeing really how much knowledge we need, expertise, understanding the ethics, but also, on the technical side, there's certainly a need for interdisciplinary teams to do this work, bringing together partners that as we have already said. What can the public sector do to build capacity, both internally to be able to deliver these initiatives, but also more generally, given that we are responsible, for regulations, laws, and for policies. So on building capacity, do you want to start, Katrina?
Sure. I'll maybe reiterate some of the things that I've been peppering throughout this talk already, and start with this idea of running small experiments. So I think whenever you're encountering something new, it's a good idea to put a lot of safeguards and control around it. Do something in a controlled environment, test it out, get some feedback, and especially get some feedback from different groups of people. What tends to happen in a lot of AI technology companies is that a very small homogeneous group of people tend to work on these projects. They're all from a particular background, and they haven't done an adequate enough job of engaging other stakeholders. And I think that's really important to do, is to engage a very diverse group of stakeholders. There's also this layer of general education I think that needs to happen for everyone, because we're encountering AI everywhere, as we've been talking about. And I'm a real proponent of education. It's why I spent a lot of time in the first year of business building this micro-credential. And I believe that everyone needs to be educated. It's not just the job of the data scientist or the machine learning team. It's everyone who's involved in both using these technologies as well as building them. And there's a level of understanding and literacy that I think needs to happen so that we can make good decisions as we go forward. And then the last piece I want to say about AI is I think that we think about technology. A lot of us have in our mind that it's like a software rollout. We're going to procure a piece of technology or build a piece of software, and then we'll roll it out and everything will be smooth and very linear. And that hasn't been the experience that I've had with these projects, or that I've seen other people have. And so I encourage people to have an R&D mindset, and that goes back to that idea of experiments, and think about this as something that is going to need continual adjusting, monitoring, care and feeding, and responsible assessment over time, because it will change and shift over time. So I think about it very much as more of an experiment that you're going to care for the long term versus a one and done kind of thing.
So the R&D mindset, adjusting, assessing, monitoring, did that all happen, Adam? With these projects, how did you bring together people to have that capacity to do the AI projects?
A lot of consultations across the country in different environments, different size organizations. That was important. Honestly, a ton of really, really interesting findings. We looked at the enablers, and then I also want to address a question in the chat about adaptive architecture in this response. So we looked at enablers and constraints to adoption across the ecosystem, and some were policy related, contractual with the funding bodies that different organizations were working with. Some were organizational in the perceptions of frontline teams, feeling that their job might be at threat of being automated and needing to consider the change management requirements to integrate these tools. And others were getting down into the use cases. So the fact that existing technologies were already in place within many of these organizations. There was a really cool finding, and I loved, because we do a lot with smaller organizations in rural markets, but ultimately the willingness to adopt new innovative technologies was higher among the smallest organizations in the sector, the smallest community serving organizations. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's less existing background infrastructure to try and find your way of massaging into. But it shows that we can engage the entire sector in the next stages of development. It doesn't have to be left to the largest best resourced service providers across the employment and training and skills network. So that was really cool. But in terms of the adaptive architecture, because it's such a diverse industry with so many different funding partners and distances from the labor market, depending on if someone is post-secondary educated going through a minor career transition, or someone has never worked or has had a major barrier or has a disability. And the languages and the guidelines of the contracts are so diverse. Again, there is no single technology solution that can solve these problems across the board. And because it's an emerging space, there is a startup culture, and you will come across many organizations that say, we've designed this so that it's perfect for you and everybody else. It doesn't work that way. So there does need to be an understanding that needs assessment and adaptation into the context in which it's used, and that specific learner or job seeker journey is critical. So you have to be working with tools that can respect the context and the needs assessment process, and the onboarding and the adaptation to background programming streams is critical. Now, thinking about the broader public sector, that's a lot, right? That's a lot of work. There's a consulting process involved there. There's a thoughtful process of preparing an organization for that type of innovation. I was recently looking at Gartner's innovation maturity model. And to date, and through the pandemic, we were very reactive. And even some of the more innovative small organizations, perhaps opportunistic. But to be ready for the type of ongoing innovation and development that we need to embrace to adopt these new technologies, or even respond to the disruption they're causing, you need to create bandwidth within the sector for that type of iterative analysis of how are we doing things now? How may it change? Have I got enough bandwidth in my team's workday to consider thinking about new challenges? Because I think there's more news about new chatbots since we even planned this session. Things are evolving very, very quickly. So I think there's certainly strong sources of R&D. The Future Skills Center has been a great source of collaboration with thought leaders. IRCC's SDI program is one that we're working with currently, and multi-year testing initiative. But there isn't really a consistent source of infrastructure support for the publicly serving sector to be able to be ready to adopt these new, or even to do the testing, the real-time, small problem solution-based testing that Katrina is referring to. And that's a challenge, because again, it's the front line. That's the front line that many of the most vulnerable are working with. And if they aren't prepared for disruption, then how are they expected to quickly turn around and meet the needs of the industries that are? I wouldn't have predicted that the creative sector was perhaps the most nervous right now. I might have thought frontline employees and service occupations and manual occupations might have been. But this is how quickly things change. And we just need that adaptive capacity within the system in order to be prepared.
Building that adaptive capacity will certainly take time, I'd imagine, and certainly bringing together partners to be able to deliver on that. Building that expertise over time in organizations will take time. Overall, to the both of you, the major barriers, well, if you could, name 2 of the major barriers that you see to adoption of AI, what would you say they are?
I think in the public sector, and I say this as someone who's been spending quite a bit of time recently in municipal government, the decision-making process in the public sector does not lend itself well to being iterative and adaptive. It is very much a roll policy rock up a hill, and then it cascades down the other side. And that often takes months and years, and there is a lot of formality to that. There is hierarchy to that. It is not an iterative, I've worked in startups as well. It is not an iterative startup mindset. And so I think that is something that you will need to grapple with in the public sector as you think about how you are going to engage with these technologies. So that's one of the things. And then I think the other thing is that we're often looking for some external guidance on this. Everybody's looking to see what everybody else is doing so that they can learn from what the other person has done. And we need some formal guidance as well. And regulations, we've been told they're coming. Bill C-27 is making its way through here in Canada, but I don't think that they can come fast enough. So I think that that is part of the solution, but it's also part of the challenge in that as things shift, move, adapt, and morph, how will we also do that on the regulatory side? And that's also a responsibility of government. It's not just about taking these technologies and using them in the work that you do. It's also about being responsible for the regulation of these technologies for society. So that's part of your role as well. So I think those are 2 massive challenges that you have to grapple with.
Yes, the regulation is certainly a responsibility of government, and certainly government tends to always be behind on the regulations. And we do certainly need to also adapt our mindset, adapt our culture so that it's more iterative and it's more of startup, and we can easily move around and move up and down the hierarchy to get our work done. Adam, the 2 major barriers.
I think one that has been challenging, and I absolutely appreciate your recommendation, Katrina, for testing on specific solutions. Our environment has so many darn variables, and so we, over time, we've been working on kind of a longitudinal analysis of these sorts of innovations, and looking at ROI in terms of reduced duplication, strength of connections across a network, and and of course the obvious ones like program outcomes. But there's so many other variables when you're working at scale across an industry network of different types of stakeholders. So it's tough to, so evaluation is one that we really, it's messy, and we're looking for solutions and the types of projects where we can test longer term on more macro levels and work with other partners. And there's not that many opportunities of working with government to test messy real world change and really systems innovation. So that's one gap that comes to mind. I'll hold it there until I remember the second gap, because I liked it too.
No worries at all. To our audience, if you do have any questions, put them into the chat. Our speakers would love to answer your questions. I wanted to ask both of you now, just looking at, how much a change there has been, looking at all these opportunities, so many barriers, everything from regulation to, internal processes to having capacity. What does that future look like for AI and for transformation, within government and, transforming the public services, and impact on stakeholders? What does that future look like?
I can start. It's rapidly changing. We have to change with it. I will now, there was a second question in the chat about, do we anticipate resistance from some of the more traditionalist institutions? Yes, we do. So that will be a gap. But the fact is that there's been demand for quite some time among industry and between stakeholder groups for a more responsive career pathway and solution. I speak from my own space, but there has been a demand for a more fluid system and way of working together. And, I hope that we can get to a stage where, those types of barriers are overcome, and we're working in real time in collaboration with government. And we have the kind of checkpoints and checks and balances that enable that and enable us to have trust working together with these new tools.
Yeah,
I'm going to end on a hopeful note. I think the really cool thing is we get to shape the future. Like, we're at a moment right now where a lot of things are negotiable, and it may not seem that way because it may seem like big, powerful forces have decided some things for us, but we get to decide. Ultimately, we live in a democracy and we get to decide. And I think there's lots of potential for us to reshape things in ways that are a lot more inclusive, equitable, and we can shift power. I think we're at a really interesting moment, but we need to take advantage of that moment in order to be able to move this in a direction that's going to be supportive of all of us and not just a handful of companies. But I think it's an exciting opportunity, and that's really why I'm here in this space, trying to help enable that future.
Thank you, Katrina, Adam. Indeed, there are a lot of change that we're grappling with, and organizations do have to shift. They do have to build these partnerships. Certainly for the public sector, and I speak for working in government, the expectations that we have to grapple with and that we have to meet are only increasing more and more since the pandemic. So we really need to transform how we work and look to shift and look for new opportunities. We have here in the chat a question on privacy. What are some of these privacy issues that come up when we tend to be looking at AI and working with data, machine learning?
I'm happy to kick that off. There's a lot of privacy issues, and I think part of it stems from this notion that we can separate out this idea of personally identifiable information. This is baked right into our legal framework. So essentially, we can take that problematic data, we can remove it, and then we can aggregate and anonymize this other data, and we can use that very safely. And there is a massive body of research that suggests with these kinds of big systems, if you amass enough data, you can actually re-identify people very easily. So that's one of the big issues when it comes to this idea of using big data with massive amounts of machine learning and computation behind it, is that it challenges the very foundation of our privacy laws. And this is something that scholars like Paul Alm at Georgetown, if you want to look up more and read some of the papers and work that he's done, you can see more about what I'm talking about. But this is part of the issue in terms of how do we move forward with massive amounts of data when we can re-identify things in ways that are problematic, essentially.
I couldn't agree more. And as I referenced earlier, during the pandemic, we saw so many organizations who are serving vulnerable populations go virtual overnight. I mean, we had the luxury of working with Osler Law, Hooper Data and Privacy Consultants, and many other subject matter experts to work on our security measures, our consents, and to try and really make sure that we were covering all of the bases, not only now, but preparing for future legislation that's coming. I think that was an anomaly. Like, I didn't see that process, and I didn't see the kind of structures in the contractual agreements change, right, from before the pandemic. I do think that all levels of government need to think about how they are playing a role in ensuring that those steps are being taken, because we didn't go back to in-person service delivery. It's hybrid now. The virtual interactions with those populations are here to stay. But I haven't seen much in the way of renewed oversight or even just guidance to that community sector on what steps they have to take. And it's a bit concerning. I know we'll get there, but we're already working on in these ways. So that for me is a top priority for future work with our government partners.
And there's certainly also, you know, in addition to the privacy, in addition to having all that technical skills and knowledge, there's the whole cybersecurity aspect in all of this. How do we also manage all of that with all these considerations that we have when we're working on these AI projects? Any thoughts on, you know, cybersecurity? There's a privacy considerations. We have some governance structures in place. What can we do to, you know, bring all that together so that we have a project that unfolds and we deliver on these results? Any best practices?
That was one kind of guiding principle behind an ecosystem-based approach, is if we could bring individuals into an environment that we knew was secure, in a single sign-on environment that was relatively safe, or more than relatively, that was safe, that we could invite other service provider organizations to use that environment to deliver services and to provide access to resources, rather than, again, sending individuals to, you know, 24 different separate environments to set up credentials and deal with whatever individual privacy and security policies each of those service providers might have had. So it's early stages, but there is some movement with organizations that have these types of environments talking about how can we grow that ecosystem so that clients can migrate from a safe environment to a safe environment. And, you know, data sharing agreements are solid and trusted, but we're, you know, at relatively early stages.
Certainly at relatively early stages, data sharing agreements, the partnerships, building one ecosystem, the interoperability between systems. Katrina, any thoughts?
Sure. I'll add two more things. So one is, if you don't have it, you can't lose it. And this really speaks to this idea of data retention, which is a piece of data governance that gets overlooked. And so the idea is that you will retain data for as long as you need it for the purposes that you're using it for, and not beyond that. And that protects you at the end of the day, because while data is an asset, it can also be a liability. So that's one piece of it. The other is the culture of your organization. Do you have a culture that takes this seriously? And unfortunately, I think there are many organizations that don't take it seriously. The tone at the top is not being set in terms of enabling these practices. And therefore, everyone just is using data in ways that make them susceptible to some kind of a cybersecurity breach, which might be an internal mistake. It's not always an attack from the outside. Sometimes these breaches happen by missharing information between two groups in an organization that maybe shouldn't have access to that particular piece of information. So that's the other thing I think about, is setting up an appropriate culture around these the use of data.
Yes, indeed. The whole cultural element is very important, whether it be with using data, transforming how we work, reacting to the change. It's all about the culture, and we do need to build a culture that does allow us to use data and AI more responsibly, and also meet the needs and also meet the needs and demands of stakeholders and of society. So on that note, I would like to conclude our discussion today on AI solutions for the public service, for the public sector, really, the data ethics, the opportunities, the challenges, the barriers, This was a very interesting and dynamic discussion. Thank you very much, Adam Morrison, President and CEO of OTEC, and Katrina Ingram from Ethically Aligned AI. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day, and we hope to see you at future IPAC Toronto events. Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Great chat.
Thank you, everyone.